Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are really digging into a very charged and honestly historically tangled event. We're looking at the 2012 attack in Benghazi, Libya.
Right. And our goal here is to try and cut through some of the, let's call it the noise, the politics, the arguments online. We want to focus very tightly on one specific source.
And it's an incredible source, isn't it? Because this is something really rare.
It absolutely is. We're looking at the very first public statement from one of the GRS contractors who was actually there on the ground during the attack. GRS being the global response staff, the security guys.
Yeah, the guy's tasked with protecting the compound, the annex. And this specific contractor, he's known publicly as Jack Silva, mostly from the movie and the book, 13 Hours.
Exactly. And the key thing here, he's been completely silent for 13 years. Nothing public at all.
13 years? That's wow.
Oh.
So why now? That's the big question. His statement seems aimed squarely at clarifying what happened on the rooftops during that final phase of the attack.
That's right. He's focused on the timeline, the actions of the different teams there, particularly the Delta Force operators who arrived later on.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really unpack his firsthand account. What details does he provide? What does he claim he saw?
And crucially, this statement comes out directly because of the online controversy, the conflicting stories. We need to be clear. Our job is to analyze what this witness says. We're not here to take sides in the veteran arguments or the politics.
Forensic analysis of this specific piece of testimony.
Got it. Okay, so let's start with the obvious. Why break 13 years of silence?
Yeah.
13 years is it's a lifetime in today's world, right?
Yeah.
Especially for an event this high profile. His colleagues spoke out. There was a book, a movie.
And yet he managed to stay completely out of the public eye regarding Benghazi. No social media presence, no interviews. It's quite remarkable, actually.
So something must have pushed him. He must feel incredibly strongly about whatever prompted this. It definitely seems that way. He's very clear in the statement that he's not looking for attention, not seeking publicity. He even says, quite specifically, that Tig didn't ask him to write this.
Tig being his fellow GRS contractor, whose own recent statements have stirred up a lot of this recent online debate.
Right, so Silva's distancing himself from any idea that this is like a coordinated GRS pushback. He says this is his decision, almost like he felt he had to do it.
Okay, so if it's not for Tig, not for fame, what was the trigger? Why put his anonymity on the line now?
His stated reason is, well, it sounds like genuine concern. He talks about seeing Tig's integrity get questioned online, specifically by podcasters or commentators who, and this is his phrase, were not there.
That's a direct challenge to their authority to comment.
It is. He felt like a narrative was building that was trying to undermine the GRS account of what happened, and he uses the phrase thrown under the bus. He didn't want his guys dragged into, and again, his words, the veteran drama of bullshit that is all over the internet.
So it's defensive. He's protecting his team's reputation, their version of events.
Exactly. It's not an attack on the Delta operators who came in, but a defense of the GRS team's memory and their reporting of the facts as they saw them.
That makes sense. He's defending their ground truth.
And he gets quite specific in his critique of the counter-narratives he was seeing. He points out that a lot of the podcasts or interviews supporting the Delta side, well, they're vague.
Vague how?
They don't actually pinpoint what specific facts in the GRS story they disagree with. It's often just, I heard that's not what happened, or implying things without stating them clearly.
So no direct rebuttal of Tig said X happened at Y time, and that's wrong because Z happened instead.
Pretty much. Silva also notes he saw some of these pro-Delta podcasts get taken down or edited after they were posted, which, might suggest some uncertainty about the claims being made.
Interesting. So if they're not specific, what do these counter-narratives rely on, according to Silva?
This is a key point he makes. They lean heavily on the status of the operators. They keep emphasizing that these guys are Tier 1.
Okay, let's pause there. Tier 1 in military circles. That carries a lot of weight, right? It implies the absolute elite, highly trained, highly vetted.
It does. And the implication Silva sees is that because they are Tier 1, their version of events, even if it's vague or secondhand, should automatically be trusted more than the contractor's version. It's appeal to authority and perceived integrity.
But Silva's point seems to be, if they're the unimpeachable source, why haven't they spoken directly?
That's exactly his rhetorical thrust. He points out that neither of the two Delta operators involved has ever, publicly given a detailed account. So all these supporters are offering is hearsay, basically, combined with emphasizing their elite credentials.
So it's reputation versus firsthand testimony.
Right. Silva says he hasn't found anything directly from the operators themselves contradicting the main GRS claims about Benghazi. There's this huge information gap where their direct voices should be. And into that gap rushes all this online speculation based on status, not specifics.
And for Silva, that just wasn't enough to discredit the guys who were actually, in the thick of it from the start.
Precisely. He felt the emphasis on Tier 1 wasn't a substitute for actual evidence, especially when it was being used to question the guys who were demonstrably exposed and fighting. So he decided he needed to provide his own direct account.
Okay, let's get into those tactical details then, because this is where his statement really aims to correct the record as he sees it, starting with when the Delta operators actually arrived.
Yes, he's very specific about this. He says they arrived at the annex just before the mortar attack began.
Just prior. Okay, that timing is absolutely critical, isn't it?
It's huge, because it means they weren't there for any of the earlier firefights that morning. The GRS team had been dealing with attacks on and off for hours before Delta showed up.
So Delta's direct involvement was limited to that final, very intense phase with the small arms, the RPGs, and crucially, the mortars.
Correct. And then Silva focuses on where people were positioned during that final attack. This is a major point of contention.
He says only the people on the rooftops were actually exposed to direct fire and could shoot back effectively.
Yes. And he explains why. You have to picture the annex compound. It had high, solid walls around it. So if attackers are outside those walls, you physically cannot shoot at them from ground level inside the compound.
You just hit the wall.
Exactly. To get a clear line of sight to engage anyone outside, you had to be up high, on the rooftops of the buildings or in the towers, like where Tig and Oz were earlier.
Okay, so elevation was essential for engaging the enemy, which leads to his most direct and probably most controversial claim.
Which he repeats apparently for clarity. He states the Delta operators were not up on the rooftops during that final attack phase.
Wow. Okay. If that's accurate, that completely shifts the narrative of who was bearing the brunt of that final assault.
It does. It means that during those critical moments when the mortars were coming in, hitting Building C, the GRS guys on the roofs were the only ones actively engaging the attackers from those exposed, elevated positions.
It directly contradicts any idea that the Delta team was up there fighting alongside them during the actual incoming fire.
That's the core of his assertion on this point.
But hold on, let me push back slightly. Even if they weren't on the roof shooting outwards, couldn't the Delta operators have been providing crucial support from the ground, securing the internal compound, ready to repel any breach, covering the GRS guys from below? That's still a vital role, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Silva doesn't necessarily deny they were present and contributing. His focus, though, seems very specific to the claims he saw related to the awards later. The language used often implies direct, continuous engagement with the external threat under fire.
Okay. So he's saying that ground-level security inside the walls, while important, isn't the same as being on the roof, exposed, returning fire, the kind of action usually cited for high combat awards for bravery under fire.
That seems to be the distinction he's drawing. By saying they weren't on the roof, he's implicitly defining their role during that specific phase as internal security and support rather than direct exposed combat against the attackers outside the walls.
Okay. And then what happens immediately after the mortars hit? Silva describes a very sudden shift.
Yeah, this is striking too. He says that after that last mortar hit, Building C, the one that killed Woods, and Doherty, the fighting just stopped completely.
Stopped. From both sides.
Both sides. He says not a single round was fired by anyone, attackers or defenders, including Delta, after that last mortar impacted. He describes the rest of the morning, right up until they left in the convoy, as actually calm and very quiet.
That really cuts against the grain of the sort of popular image of a running gun battle right up to the last second. Intense strike, then silence.
A sudden, devastating strike, followed by quiet. That's the picture he paints.
And he uses a couple of later observations about weapons to support his point about who was firing during that final attack phase.
Right, the accidental discharges. He mentions two specific incidents later that morning. One happened shortly after they got to the airport, out on the tarmac.
Okay.
And the other one was actually inside the aircraft that was flying the wounded guys, Oz and Dave Ubin, to Tripoli.
Two accidental discharges. How does he connect that back to the fight at the annex?
He uses it as a piece of logical deduction, almost like forensic evidence. His reasoning seems to be, the compound went quiet right after the mortars. These accidental discharges happened later, in secure locations. Therefore, it's unlikely the Delta operators fired their weapons at all that morning after the mortar attack ceased.
Okay, I see the logic, but isn't that a bit of a leap? Couldn't they have fired during the brief mortar attack, then cleared their weapons, and then had an AD later due to stress or fatigue? An AD later doesn't automatically mean 0 shots fired earlier, does it?
It's definitely a deduction, not direct proof. But Silva presents it as strong supporting evidence, especially because, as he argues, there's no claim from the Delta side about specific engagements during that final phase. He seems to imply that if they had been in a heavy exchange of fire justifying major awards, having only these later accidental discharges recorded seems odd.
So the implication is their weapons were essentially safe or hadn't been fired in anger right up until those ADs happened, which would bolster his claim they weren't firing from the roof during the attack.
That appears to be exactly the inference he wants the reader to draw. It supports his timeline. Intense but brief mortar attack hitting the roof guys, then immediate silence, then a focus on rescue and evac.
Which logically shifts the Delta role upon arrival just before the mortars, from primarily fighters in that final battle to primarily rescuers and medical support immediately after it.
That's the consequence of his timeline and positioning details, yes. Their main contribution, according to Silva's account of that specific period, becomes the post-attack response.
Okay, let's focus on that response then. Building C takes the hit. What does Silva say happened right after?
He highlights Tig's actions first. He says Tig was the first one up onto the roof of Building C to check on Woods and Doherty and the wounded Dave Ubben.
Okay, Tig goes up first.
And critically, Silva says Tig was up there alone dealing with the casualties for several minutes before anyone else joined him.
Several minutes alone on a roof that just took multiple mortar hits, with potentially still active threats around. That's significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Silva emphasizing that delay seems intended to underscore the risk Tig took, while implicitly the highly trained Delta team was still below.
And this delay in Delta getting up there seems to be a real sticking point for Silva. He calls it an uncomfortably long time.
Yeah, he suggests the delay was noticeable enough that it needed someone else to intervene. According to Silva, Delta only came up to help after Tig specifically asked for assistance over the radio.
Tig had to call for help.
Apparently so. And not just that, Silva says an OD, that's operator of the day, heard the request over the radio and basically threatened to leave his own post somewhere else to come help Tig if Delta didn't move immediately.
Whoa. Okay, who is the OD usually? And why would his threat carry so much weight?
The OD is typically in a command or oversight role, often located remotely, maybe back at base or a command center monitoring communications. For an OD to hear the traffic and feel the need to say, if you guys don't get up there, I will abandon my post and do it, that suggests a serious breakdown or delay in the expected response on the ground.
So the implication is Delta's assistance wasn't immediate or automatic. It required a direct plea for help and then essentially an order over the radio from someone higher up or in a command position.
That's the sequence Silva lays out. It paints a picture of hesitation or perhaps confusion in those initial moments after the mortars hit, at least regarding getting personnel up onto that devastated roof.
It suggests maybe the tactical assessment or triage took longer than Silva felt was appropriate, especially given Delta's reputation for rapid action.
That seems fair. However, Silva does confirm that once they were up there, they did provide help.
Right. He mentions seeing one of them carry Dave Ubben down.
Yes, he specifically says he witnessed one Delta operator carrying the wounded Ubben down the ladder on his back. So he acknowledges that physical assistance and risk-taking did occur once they engaged in the rescue.
Okay. Now this brings us to probably the most visceral and debated part of the rooftop events, the handling of Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty's bodies. Tig had previously described them being thrown off the roof. What does Silva say?
Silva was watching this from his own position on the roof of Building D, nearby. And he states very directly, what Tig said about Tyrone and Glenn Bub Doherty being thrown off the roof is 100% true.
So he confirms the action itself, that it happened.
He confirms the physical act, but then he adds a crucial piece of context, which really changes how you might interpret that action.
Which is the timing relative to the attack.
Exactly. He stresses that when this happened, when the bodies were moved off the roof in that manner, there was no incoming fire. 0. And hadn't been any for, he estimates, at least 15 minutes.
Okay, that's huge, because throwing bodies sounds awful, maybe panicked if you imagine it happening under fire.
Right. But if it happened during that period of calm Silva described, it wasn't an act of desperation while dodging bullets. Silva's context suggests it was more likely an operational decision, maybe prioritizing speed to get everyone consolidated for evacuation, given the compound was compromised and they needed to leave quickly.
So less about panic, more about urgent necessity in a fragile, quiet period. It doesn't make it less grim, but it changes the reason behind the action.
It reframes it significantly, moving it from potential battlefield callousness under duress to a calculated, if harsh, logistical move during a lull.
Okay. Let's shift to another point. Silva addresses the recovery of Ambassador Stevens's body. There were some accounts, apparently from Delta supporters, suggesting the operators were involved in complex negotiations, maybe even a risky mission, to get the ambassador's body back.
Yeah, Silva tackles this one pretty directly, too, based on what he personally saw.
And what was that? Did he see Delta go out on a retrieval mission?
No, his account is much simpler. He says the ambassador's body just showed up. It arrived at the airport in the back of a Libyan militia pickup truck, while everyone, GRS survivors, Delta, State Dep personnel, was already there, waiting to be flown out.
So the body was brought to them at the airport, not retrieved by them from somewhere else in Benghazi.
According to Silva's eyewitness account, yes. Which means if Delta did have any role in negotiations, it must have happened remotely, like over a phone or maybe in a very brief conversation with the militia guys right there on the tarmac.
But they didn't leave the airport or the annex to go on a dangerous mission to find and recover the body.
Silva's testimony directly contradicts that scenario. Again, it reinforces his overall narrative, that after arriving just before the mortars, the focus was on securing the annex, dealing with the immediate aftermath, and then getting everyone evacuated from the airport, not on external operations.
This logically leads us into the most sensitive part of Silva's statement. His comments on the official awards given to the two Delta Force operators. These weren't minor awards. We're talking the Navy Cross and the Distinguished Service Cross.
Yeah, second only to the Medal of Honor. These are incredibly high-level decorations, and they become part of the permanent, official military record of the event.
So for Silva, a direct participant, to question the factual basis of the citations for those awards,
Right.
that's a pretty bold move.
It's huge, because these awards aren't just handed out. They're supposed to be a rigorous process of verification, eyewitness accounts, reports. If a primary witness like Silva is saying, hang on, the description in the citation doesn't match what I saw, it raises serious questions.
Questions about the verification process itself, or maybe about which version of events was prioritized for the official record.
Exactly. What specific parts of the citations does he challenge?
He focuses on language commonly used in these high-level awards. Specifically, he questions the phrase, saying the operators were continuously exposed to fire while shepherding unarmed civilians to safety.
Okay, let's break that down. He challenges it on two levels, right? The continuously exposed part and the unarmed civilians part.
Right. Tactically, how does he challenge continuously exposed?
Well, based on his timeline we just discussed, if the main firefight involving Delta's arrival was intense but brief, immediately followed by that long period of calm after the mortars hit, then the term continuously exposed just doesn't fit his recollection. Exposure was intense, yes, but short-lived, and primarily limited to the guys on the roof, where he says Delta wasn't.
So the duration implied by continuously is the issue for him.
Seems so.
Yeah.
And then there's the unarmed civilians part. Why does he object to that description?
This is a really interesting factual point he makes. He states clearly, everyone at the annex was armed. He even mentions the cook carried a shotgun.
Okay, why is that distinction, armed versus unarmed, so important in the context of an awards citation?
Because describing the people being rescued as unarmed civilians dramatically increases the perceived risk and heroism of the rescuer. Guiding terrified, defenseless people through gunfire is one level of risk.
Right.
Guiding trained, armed security personnel, even if they're wounded or disoriented, who can potentially still defend themselves or assist in their own rescue, that's a different tactical situation. The risk profile changes.
So Silva is suggesting that using unarmed civilians in the citation potentially inflates the danger the operators faced and the bravery required compared to the reality of assisting fellow armed personnel.
That appears to be his argument. If the official citations contain inaccuracies about the duration of exposure and the status of the people being helped, it suggests the historical record, the one enshrined by these awards, might be flawed on some fundamental tactical facts.
It implies perhaps that the narrative chosen for the citation emphasized certain aspects to meet the high criteria for those awards, possibly overlooking details that didn't fit as neatly.
Yeah. But it's really important to stress, Silva seems very careful not to make this a blanket condemnation of the operators. He includes nuance.
Absolutely. He goes out of his way to say he was grateful they came. He calls their willingness to fly into that dangerous situation heroic in itself. That's a crucial acknowledgement.
He also says he's pretty sure they provided life-saving medical care inside Building C after the attack, even though he didn't personally see it happen.
Right. So his critique is laser-focused on specific claims related to combat exposure and the citation language, not on their overall courage or the value of their medical assistance. It's about tactical accuracy versus the official story.
And then he includes that one incredibly specific personal detail, the anecdote about the knife.
Ah, yes, this is powerful. He recounts that before they all left Libya, he personally thanked both operators. And he gave one of them described as the blonde one wearing a ball cap and aviator sunglasses, his own orange Benchmade triage rescue knife as a token of gratitude.
An orange bench-made knife, why include that specific detail? What's its significance now, years later?
It's like a physical piece of evidence connecting his memory directly to one of the awardees. He even notes in the statement that this detail will prove to the recipient that the statement is genuinely from him.
So regardless of any disagreement about who did what on the roof, this shared moment, this physical object exists. It validates Silva's presence, his interaction with that operator, and his feeling of gratitude at that time.
Exactly. It anchors his credibility as an eyewitness to the operator himself. It says, you know I was there, you know we talked, remember this. It adds significant weight to the rest of his detailed account because it establishes that personal connection beyond dispute.
Okay, so finally, how does Silva wrap this up in terms of the overall GRS narrative? Does he stand by Tig and the account in the 13 Hours book?
He says he stands 100% behind Tig's version of events, and he defends the consistency of the GRS accounts more broadly.
How so?
He points out how the book 13 Hours came together. He says the 5 surviving GRS contractors individually told their stories to the author. They didn't sit down and coordinate or, as he puts it, conspire to create a narrative.
So the book is a compilation of separate recollections.
Yes, and Silva emphasizes that these individual perspectives largely coincide. The fact that 5 guys, recalling a chaotic event from their own viewpoints, ended up with stories that align so closely is, for him, strong evidence against any claims that they just made up a convenient story together.
It counters the idea that they colluded to make themselves look good or someone else look bad.
Precisely. His statement, coming after 13 years of silence, acts almost like the final independent verification of those core GRS claims. He insists their only motive, then and now, was just getting the truth out about what happened on the ground. #tag outro exista.
Okay, so let's pull back and think about what this deep dive into Jack Silva's statement really gives us and gives you, the listener. We've gotten some incredibly specific, granular detail here.
Yeah, and it's focused very tightly on that period between the final mortar strike and the extraction. That's a time frame that's often been murky or filled with conflicting accounts.
We've essentially introduced a new piece of primary source evidence into the historical debate, and this source directly challenges 2 really contentious points.
Right. First, the idea that the Delta operators were on the roof engaged in fighting during that final mortar attack. Silva flatly denies that.
And second, the context around how the bodies of Woods and Doherty were handled. Silva confirms Tig's account of them being thrown, but crucially adds that it happened during a period of calm, not under fire.
So we're not just retelling the story. We're adding this very specific, first-hand counter-narrative to the existing record.
And it really underscores just how difficult it is to get a single, universally accepted truth about chaotic events like this, especially when you have reputations, high-level awards, and frankly, politics involved.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How these tiny details become so critical years later. The exact timing of a radio call from the OD, whether there were 15 minutes of quiet, the color of a knife handle, these become the linchpins when the big narratives collide.
It seems like the core disagreement boils down to definitions, maybe? Silva seems to suggest the recognized heroism might have been more about the undeniable bravery of flying in, and the critical medical aid and extraction support provided after the main attack, rather than prolonged exposed combat during it, which the citations imply.
Yeah, that shift in focus from exposed combatant during the peak fight to critical responder immediately after seems to capture the heart of the tactical disagreement presented in Silva's account.
So here's something for you to really mull over after listening to this. The GRS members, according to Silva, gave individual accounts back then that largely matched up, suggesting they weren't conspiring. Silva's account now backs that up. But the Delta operators themselves have remained silent. Silva highlights this gap.
So the question becomes, what does that sustained silence from the operators imply about why there's still disagreement over these very specific tactical details? Is it just a different memory of events? Or is it something deeper, maybe about how their actions are interpreted against the immense expectations placed on Tier 1 operators in such a critical, violent, but ultimately quite brief final phase of the incident?
It leaves this historical question mark, doesn't it? A gap that arguably only detailed public statements from those operators themselves could truly fill, allowing the official record to be either fully corroborated or potentially revised based on all available first-hand accounts.
Until then, we have these conflicting narratives, anchored by details like an orange knife and the timing of silence.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this compelling source material. We'll see you next time.